By the end of the Civil War, the West is already legendary. It is looked upon as the frontier rather than the great American desert, an empty land awaiting settlement and civilization, a place for fresh beginnings and bold undertakings.
The great myth makers of the Old West, people like Frederick Remington in art, people like Owen Wister in literature, the author of The Virginian, academics like Frederick Jackson Turner. These myth makers had most of their impact, I think, in the 20th century, rather than at the time of the settlement of the West itself, or of the Western frontier itself. Their great impact was on those of us in the 20th century who look back on that time and would like to sort of recapture it in one way or another.
Whereas Turner celebrated the pioneer advance across the continent as the centerpiece of the making of an American society, the new Western historians have tended to invert the story, to pay far more attention, deservedly so, to the casualties that accompanied American expansion, to the environmental and human and cultural costs associated with that expansionism, to put more attention on Indians, on ethnic minorities, and on women.
The expansion that transforms the far West and its economy begins in the mid-19th century with the arrival of the miners.
In the case of both gold and silver mines, sometimes these boons were quite short-lived, only a matter of months or even weeks. The richest silver deposits generally tended to last longer. Probably the best example of this, of course, is the Comstock Lode in Nevada, on the eastern slopes of the Sierra Nevada. Over time, the Comstock produced something in the neighborhood of $300 million in silver, and it was by far the richest paying mining area in the world of its day.
A second major economic surge occurs with the emergence of the cattle kingdom.
There was a shortage of supply of beef in the Northeast, primarily because of the Civil War. So much of it had been used to feed the Union armies. There was a great supply of beef, probably somewhere between 2 and 3 million head of these cattle in southern Texas. Because there was a great deal of supply there and very little demand, the market price of these cattle was virtually nothing, maybe $5 a head. If you could somehow magically move that same animal from southern Texas up to the Ohio Valley to Cincinnati or to New York, you could get anywhere from $25 to $35 a head. The trick was, how do you bring those two things together?
You need trains to begin to move minerals, to begin to move cattle, to begin to move wheat, to begin to do all the things that the West can produce, but there was no way to get it to market until the railroads come in. The railroads, in effect, begin to change everything, and they change it so quickly that it astonishes people.
And beginning in 1867, the first herds of cattle were driven northward out of southern Texas, up along those famous cattle trails like the Chisholm Trail, up into Kansas, first to the town of Abilene, where they made connection with the railroad, loaded on those cattle cars, and sent back to the east for slaughter.
But like the mining industry, the early economic success of cattle ranchers is difficult to sustain.
A lot of people got into it, and within a few years, the prices of cattle began to fluctuate rather dramatically. Luckily, this coincided with the beginnings of the spread of ranching northward out of Texas, out of the southwest, onto the Great Plains, eventually all the way up into the northern plains and into Canada. And so this was an alternate market for those cattle. This was the greatest and most rapid spread of domesticated animals in the history of the world.
The life of the cowboy also becomes part of the legend of the West, although not all of it is quite as it is portrayed.
We think of a cowboy as being self-reliant. Certainly, in many ways, he had to be. We think of a cowboy as being tough, and it is very difficult work. Anyone who's ever tried to do it. So those elements of the myth of the cowboy, the legend of the cowboy, are certainly based in reality. It should also be kept in mind that the cowboy was working for someone else. He was not independent in that sense. He wasn't working for very good money, and still isn't. These were difficult, dirty, monotonous jobs. A great majority of cowboys who went with the herds up the cattle trail on these cattle drives only did it once. They considered among the most miserable experiences of their lives. So I think that is one way to remind ourselves about the tarnished side, let's say, of this cowboy legend. Another part of the legend is that cowboys were naturally raucous. When these cowboys came into the cattle town at the end of the cattle drive, when they came into Dodge City or Rose, Abilene, there was a great deal of drinking, a great deal of hanging out in bordellos, a great deal of gambling, fighting. They've been under a rather iron control of a boss, and suddenly have money in their pockets and a chance to be on their own.
Does it naturally follow that the West is a dangerous place to be in the late 1800s?
The kinds of violence that are central to this Western legend, that is shootouts in the middle of the street, were far less common than legend would have it. Study of cattle towns in Kansas, for example, show in the neighborhood of one homicide annually. So those sort of mythicized forms of violence were not nearly as common, nearly as frequent as we think.
Other types of violence, however, do occur.
For example, the assaults on Indians in the mining areas of California, violence against other ethnic groups, against Hispanics in the Southwest, violence against Chinese in California and in places like Wyoming, violence of capital against labor, union busting in these mining areas, in lode mining areas, a great deal of what we might call social or ethnic violence. That, I think, is what we need to pay more attention to as historians, rather than the kinds of shootouts on Main Street at high noon that are part of the popular lore.
Given their image of the West as virgin territory awaiting the civilizing influence of white settlers, newcomers seem somewhat surprised that Native Americans have a different point of view.
The relationship between the United States and Indian peoples is in some ways an odd one. Because the United States, if you look only at the laws, has what might be accounted the best record towards Indians of any nation in the Western Hemisphere. I think Vine Deloria, in one of his books, even says this. And the reason you can say it is because legally the United States recognizes Indian peoples as semi-sovereign nations who own the land until it's ceded to the United States, who have a set of basic rights which cannot be taken away from them by the United States, and so that they're given a whole set of legal protections. And then you have the United States attempt at certain times to subvert it when it gets in their way. And both things go on at once, so there's this constant tension.
One of the most dramatic examples of this tension occurs in Idaho in 1877. For decades, members of the Nez Perce tribe have been living quietly and peacefully in Oregon.
After the Little Bighorn took place and the killing of Custer's soldiers, a demand went out throughout the West to take all non-reservation Indians and force them onto the reservation.
In the Northwest, General Howard receives orders to force the Nez Perce onto reservations. The tribe resists. As the medicine man explains,
the earth was sacred to them, that it held the bones of their ancestors, that they could not surrender it, and that they had made no agreement. That white people made these agreements, that they divided up the land in such a way, but the Indians had not done it. Finally, Howard became angry and threatened Chief Joseph and all the various leaders. He pointed to them and said, "Will you go to the reservation or will we fight?" And every one of them agreed that they would have to go to the reservation. Then years later, Chief Joseph said of that day, he said, "We were like the deer, and he was the grizzly bear. We had to agree." So they went back to their villages and prepared to get ready to move to this smaller parcel of land. But when they did, some young men, Walitas, killed a few white men who had been doing harm and harassing Indian people, and then a few more people were killed, and it triggered the Nez Perce War.
The tribe's leader, Chief Joseph, convinces his followers to run from the retribution that is sure to come.
As Chief Joseph flees towards Canada, you already have the tourist West developing, and he's leading the Nez Perce through Yellowstone National Park, and among the people he captures turns out to be these tourists who just wandered through to see the new national park, to see the wonders of Yellowstone. And what they blunder into is really the last of the Indian Wars, and I think who knows who's more surprised.
They're all the way up to the Canadian border, and they are stopped there by Colonel Miles. Then the people negotiate a settlement in which they were to return to Idaho, but instead they're put on flatboats and taken down to Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, and then into the Indian Territory of Oklahoma. But when they came back, some of them were forced to go to the Colville Reservation, not the Nez Perce Reservation, and Chief Joseph died on the Colville Reservation up in northern part of Washington.
Sporadic fighting between whites and Indians continues as Indians struggle to maintain the remnants of their civilization.
The United States, the American Indian policy is never genocidal in the sense that what it's aimed at doing is eliminating Indian population. The fear of Americans is that, in fact, the Indian population will disappear and that somehow there's going to be a blot on the Republic. They certainly want Indians as distinctive cultural members to disappear, but they want them to choose to do so. When Indians are not eager enough to do this, the United States will apply great coercive pressure to get them to do it, from Indian schools, taking children away, banning religion. So at the same time, again, you have this sense of wanting consent, of you will assimilate, and if you don't assimilate, we apply this incredible force.
The stated goal of American Indian policy was to integrate Indian peoples into the national mainstream. That meant making them farmers of a particular sort, farmers of the Jeffersonian model, being reasonably self-sufficient, but at the same time contributing to a national and international market. That had always been the goal, the official goal of the government. By the late 19th century, as the West began to fill up with European Americans, then there was greater and greater pressure to open Indian lands. It's those two developments that converge in what was called the Dawes Act of 1887. So what the Dawes Act said basically was this, that each tribe would draw up tribal rolls. They would draw up a list of persons who belonged to that tribe. Reservation land would be surveyed, and each family and each individual would be given a kind of a homestead. Each of these parcels of land would be held in trust for 25 years. That is, the Indians would not be allowed to sell them. This is supposedly to prevent people from coming in and persuading them to sell them for much less than they were worth.
The tribes had difficulty just surviving because they were renegades if they moved off of the reservation to go hunt or fish or gather. And so the United States established a system of rations, providing ration days for Indian people to line up. And we have wonderful photographs showing ration day of bringing cattle in and then butchering the cattle and then throwing different elements of the animal, like the insides of the animals, out the back window, and women there with big buckets and pails to gather the inside parts of the animal. They needed to use every part of it. The horns were ground up and used in food as well. That the United States created a situation in which Indians could not feed themselves because they couldn't get to their foods.
The Dawes Act itself is not considered a success, either by Native Americans or the government.
In fact, it turned out to be more or less a disaster because of poor administration, because of corruption. In many cases, these Indian peoples were given the worst of the land. Many refused to cooperate, signing up on the rolls. They wanted to hold on this land, of course, communally. They wanted to keep it in the way that they always had. They considered this a collective possession of them as a people, not to be divvied up, not to be divided up and given to individuals. So they simply refused to cooperate. That meant that if they were not on the rolls, they didn't get any land. The land was still divided and given away. They were now just out of it, at a loss.
The arrival of the miners, the empire building of the cattle ranchers, the dispersal of the Indian tribes, all serve as a prelude to a massive movement of farmers into the Plains region.
More land was brought under cultivation in the United States between 1870 and 1900 than in all of American and colonial history prior to that. The most dramatic growth came on the eastern Great Plains, where this agricultural economy that was so well developed in the American Midwest spread across the Mississippi River, across the Missouri River, into Kansas and Nebraska, into South Dakota, into Iowa, into those regions. The beginning of cultivation of grains. But farming was also booming elsewhere throughout the West during these years. It was booming in the interior West in areas that were developed to feed these new centers of population, the mining towns. It was developing in Utah around Salt Lake. It was booming in California. It was developing in the Willamette Valley of Oregon. So agriculture was developing in many different parts of the West. It developed very rapidly with the aid of the new technology of agriculture, and of course the aid of the railroad.
Just a few years earlier, such rapid agricultural growth would have seemed unlikely.
Lots of the soldiers who fought in the Indian Wars of the 1870s and 80s rode home and they asked, "We don't know why we're fighting this war. This land is not going to be land that anyone is going to want." Americans were used to evaluating the quality of land based on the quality of trees that grew upon it, which is not an accurate way of understanding the fertility of soils. But the Great Plains had no trees on it. And so it was called by an early expedition the Great American Desert, and that term remained on maps of the United States well into the 19th century.
The interior, far west, has an environment that is one of the most unpredictable and erratic in the Western Hemisphere. For example, in an area of the plains that has an average annual rainfall of 15 inches, that might mean 20 or 22 inches one year, and it might mean 7 inches the next. A very risky business. During the early years of this great agricultural boom on the plains went through one of its periodic wet cycles. So, by good luck, it rained a good bit more than usual.
People began to farmstead on this land. They were given generous grants of land on either side of the railroad tracks. In fact, 10 miles in a checkerboard pattern on either side of their right-of-way was granted to them by Congress. And in order to sell it to farmers, they participated in one of the great deceptions of American land history, which was that essentially rain would follow the plow. It may look droughty to you, settler, but in fact, once you put in your crops, the climate itself will change. It was an out-and-out lie.
And so consequently, they began to overcommit themselves to farming in this region. And then in the 1890s, the hammer came down. The rainfall stopped. The drought came. And when that happened, the result was economic and human disaster.
Farm life on the Great Plains is different than farming in the Midwest or points east.
They built sod houses, literally these mud huts, in which they cut bricks out of the sod. Or you could also burn it for fuel.
They had to develop, for example, new types of plows, steel-tipped plows of a certain shape that would cut through the sod more easily. Barbed wire that was developed in the 1870s in Illinois, a cheap and practical device to keep animals, grazing animals like cattle and horses, out of certain areas, especially away from crops and away from certain water sources. So, millions and millions of pounds of barbed wire began to be produced almost overnight.
Barbed wire conjures up yet another image from tales of the Old West. The hostility that is said to exist between farmers and cattle ranchers.
There was to some degree a natural competition between farmers and cattlemen, and for obvious reasons. Those are two very different ways to use what was, after all, at the same time, one of the great natural pastures on the planet, and also some of the richest soil on Earth. In some ways, however, that competition is a little overdone. The Great Plains is best understood as a mixture of these two economies during these years. And furthermore, if you look at the plains as a whole, you'll see that there is a fairly clear division of how that land could be used. Toward the west is an area where only ranching makes sense. Farther to the east, where there's more rain, it really makes more sense to farm that area. So the conflict really, I think, is somewhat exaggerated.
By the late 19th century, American farming no longer resembles the comfortable image of independent farm families. In many cases, they've been replaced by the commercial farmer, who attempts to do in the West what industrialists are doing in the manufacturing economy.
The countryside that took shape in California at the beginning might have looked like any place of settlement in the far west or in the Midwest. People came in, they organized small farms, generally of mixed crops and livestock. By the 1860s, capitalists, people who had never been farmers, or people who certainly had never farmed on a large scale, came to the San Joaquin Valley, and they organized wheat fields on a truly remarkable scale. It was called bonanza wheat farming, that word meaning sky high or blue sky. These are wheat fields that were simply larger than anything anyone had seen before.
Cattle, beef, oxen, these animals required an enormous amount of feed. They could eat natural forage to a point, but they had to be supplemented with grains that were grown in the field, and also hay.
These commercial activities alter the look and feel of traditional agriculture.
It used a new breed of machinery that had been invented in California. Gang plows that would have 10, 20 horses pulling each one. Obviously, this required groups of men, homeless, migratory men, to harvest these crops. It took them a month, in some cases, to do this, camping, sleeping, eating in the field, sort of like the way that cowboys would move from Texas up to the railheads in Kansas, eating and sleeping along the way. This wheat, once harvested, went to the wharves in San Francisco, was loaded into some of the same ships that brought miners, and it was then carried around the Cape and then ultimately to Liverpool, England, which was its destination. There had never been a trade in an agricultural commodity that had gone this distance before. And it was undertaken by capitalists who were extraordinarily bold, who conducted this with very little insurance, but simply depended upon the economies that they realized in the production of the crop. The fact that the land was virtually free for the taking, the fact that they were never going to restore this land, and the fact that labor and transportation were relatively inexpensive.
Worldwide overproduction leads to a drop in prices for most agricultural products in the late 1880s. Farm families are painfully aware that something is wrong. But instead of blaming the glut of products on the market, they blame the railroad, the banks, and the government.
By the late 1880s and the early 1890s, the discontent among American farmers, especially on the Great Plains and in parts of the South, was rising to an extraordinary pitch. The basic cause was that the price of the things that they were growing were declining, and they were not able then to make enough money to pay their mortgages, to support themselves, to in some cases to feed their families. In the first place, paradoxically, farmers were suffering partly from their own success. The increase in the production was so great during these years that it simply outpaced the demand for those products. At the same time, the farmers themselves had made great economic commitments that now they were caught with. Their mortgage wasn't going down with the prices. The debts that they owed were not disappearing. The taxes they were paying were not changing. At an earlier time, many of these same farmers have been the first ones eager to commit themselves to those taxes by passing bond issues to try to attract railroads into their town, for example, by committing themselves to certain kinds of social and economic development that they thought would attract more settlement. But now, when the bad years came, they tended to turn on the railroads, the same railroads that they had tried to draw out onto the plains, to turn on the bankers who were holding the mortgages that these farmers had signed, to turn on the governments that were imposing taxes. This resulted in a social and a political upheaval on the Great Plains that was part of a larger feeling of discontent among other groups in the United States in the closing years of the 19th century.
And yet, in just a few short decades, the West has become bound up in the economic interests of the nation. The people of the West are not always satisfied with their role in this equation, but they are nonetheless essential to it.
The American West is becoming critical to capitalist development. It's seen as a place which supplies raw materials to the rest of the United States and will set in motion this boom-bust economy. The kinds of classic Western industries, or late 19th century industries, cattle ranching, timber production in the Northwest, mineral production outside of California and Idaho, and the Homestake Mine in South Dakota, all of these things, New Mexico, Arizona. Wheat farming, the great wheat boom as they move into the Dakotas and on into eastern Montana, eastern Colorado. All of these things basically supply raw goods which will be refined and finished elsewhere. And Westerners begin to complain that they are being reduced to being hewers of wood and carriers of water for the larger economy. That in fact the capital that's necessary for industrialization, for the things that yield real wealth, go to the east. And there's going to be this constant complaint which will show up in Western political movements, will show up in the West's demand that if private capital is not going to develop the West, then the government should develop the West. that they are being left out of these larger trends. But in fact, it's one of the things that happens in the West is that you can't understand the late 19th century West without understanding this larger world economy. We think of it as people in log cabins out in the middle of nowhere, but in fact, all of them are producing goods which are creating things which are going to be used all over the United States, on into Europe, into South America, beginning to penetrate the whole world economy. So the West is not some distant backwater. It's critical, but it sees itself as unequal and is colonized by the rest of the United States.
Southern industry does expand in the years that follow.
In an effort to diversify the economy, not just be dependent on one crop, cotton, which was very problematical after the war, but expand that. Build a textile industry so you don't send the cotton up north.
The steel industry in Alabama, textiles in the Carolinas, those new jobs that provide an alternative to landowner labor are restricted to whites. Those new economic opportunities are for white people.
Some blacks, however, do manage to acquire property, establish small businesses, and enter professions. The key is education. And for a time, the major spokesman for the importance of education for his race is Booker T. Washington, founder of the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama.
Booker T. Washington's an enormously important figure, both for what he actually did and what he represented. It is perhaps the most extraordinary of all the American rags to riches stories. So, symbolically, he was a testament to what African Americans could do in freedom. At the same time, he built up Tuskegee as an entirely black-run institution with black faculty, black students, teaching subjects relevant to African Americans at a time when, of course, blacks could not go, at least in the South, to white institutions. And he finally articulated a vision of how it was that blacks were going to survive in an era of white supremacy. The compromises, as he saw it, was that African Americans would strive for a degree of economic autonomy, and once they had that, then white America would have to deal with them from a position of power as opposed to a position of weakness. It's not that he believed that African Americans should completely sacrifice political rights, equality, but that the first priority was that economic institutional foundation. Others, Ida Wells, W.E.B. Du Bois, argued that you couldn't separate out black aspirations. So he was being criticized from both sides.
Few white Southerners ever accept the idea of racial equality. The fact that former slaves acquire any legal and political rights at all is the result of federal support. That support all but vanishes after federal troops withdraw in 1877.
One of the things that happens with the end of Reconstruction is total disfranchisement. The 15th Amendment had given African American men the vote, but in the 1880s, the 1890s, the grandfather clauses, the white primary, took the vote away, and particularly through terror, just sheer, unadulterated terror. Pogroms where you have whole villages just being uprooted and burned out.
The states started passing segregation laws in the South. And in particular, in 1890, Louisiana passed a law saying that railroads had to be segregated. And this gave rise to the famous case of Plessy versus Ferguson. Plessy versus Ferguson is an interesting case. Plessy was chosen because he was only 1/8 black. The lawyer who was going to try the case wanted to make a particular point in court. And so they chose someone who was very light-skinned and who could not be told from a white person if you just saw him.
Of the several test cases that are appealed, this is the only one that reaches the Supreme Court.
The decision was, 7-1. One of the justices was out of the country, and the dissenter was John Marshall Harlan. The justice who had written the opinion in the court, Henry Billings Brown of Michigan, had said that the law was equal. It prevented blacks from being in white coaches. It prevented whites from being in black coaches. Harlan knew, as Henry Billings Brown actually knew, that this was nonsense, that in fact it was meant to discriminate. And he said so in no uncertain terms. And it was a dissent which has become very important in U.S. history. Here we are in 1900. The federal attempt to protect black rights has failed because of Supreme Court decisions. The state efforts to protect black rights have succeeded in the North. In the South, there is considerable disfranchisement by constitutional amendment, and blacks are not very well off at all.
With each year that passes, the limitations on blacks seem to tighten, choking off the gains that were achieved just after the Civil War.
Violence allowed Democrats usually to take over the polls. They would stuff the ballot box and simply make up returns. Louisiana was the worst. Sometimes 125% of the people would vote, and strangely enough, they would all vote Democratic. This was in areas that were 70, 80, 90% black, where surely they were all voting Republican. And then they had a constitutional convention, and they passed laws, literacy tests, property tests, poll taxes, and other infringements on the right to vote, and that made it much more difficult for blacks to get registered. Sometimes they would pass these with exemptions for some whites, the so-called grandfather clauses, or understanding clauses, requiring that you read and understand the Constitution in order to be registered to vote. And violence, although important, really didn't manage to eliminate the black vote. It was laws that eliminated the black vote.
The 1890s, however, witness a record number of lynchings. Most of the victims are black.
The image of lynching is frontier justice. There's an absence of courts, and there are criminals that have to be punished, and so the outraged citizenry comes together and delivers rough justice to somebody who really deserves it. But in the American South, where thousands upon thousands of victims died at the hands of lynch mobs, the purposes, the function, the way in which lynching unfolded has nothing to do with that sort of mythic image of lynching. Instead, it was a brutal form of oppression intended to silence, intimidate, and terrorize African Americans, as well as a few other groups in the South that some whites believed had to be kept in their place. So there's no way to take lynching as it unfolded in the South and gussy it up and make it into something that fits in with some sort of tradition of frontier justice. It's just raw oppression.
These instances of raw oppression do not occur as frequently in some parts of the South as in others.
Wherever there was cotton cultivation, there were tensions built into labor relations that provided those sort of flashpoints for violence between whites and blacks. In Virginia, for example, where blacks had a little bit more freedom, a little bit more economic autonomy, there are fewer of those flashpoints, so that there are still lynchings, approximately 100 in Virginia, but there aren't the 500 that there were in Mississippi.
Since lynching is an illegal activity, there are few records to show just who is involved.
However, there are a variety of ways in which we can have a pretty good idea of who participated, and it ranged with the population of the white South. There were lynchings in which most of the mob members were family members of some alleged victim of crime. There were other cases when the whole cross-cut of the community, white community, would participate. So it's not as though any one group of white Southerners participated. One way of saying it is that in any given Southern community, any white Southerner could participate in a lynching. That didn't mean they always did, but they could.
The victims of lynching are as varied as the architects of the violence.
I'll use a specific example. The lynching of an African American named Sam Hose outside of Atlanta in 1899. Sam Hose originally got involved in a dispute with his white employer, defended himself, and in the process killed his attacker, his white employer. Then he fled the scene. Within a matter of days, white newspapers in Atlanta started circulating the story that he had not only murdered his employer, but then he had raped multiple times his employer's wife beside the dead body of her husband, and had nearly dashed the brains out of her young infant child.
When Sam Hose is caught and transported back to Atlanta, the train in which he is riding passes through the town where the crime had allegedly taken place. The lynch mob is waiting.
And there were thousands upon thousands of spectators who had come from Atlanta on special trains that had been run simply to carry them to the lynching. So that was a huge ritual of extermination at which thousands of people participated. It was reported in newspapers not only all over the United States, but literally around the world. The horror of lynching wasn't just what it did to the victims of the lynch mob, but of course what it must have done to the participants and what it did to the African American community and what it did to people who read about it. Richard Wright talks about how in his youth, and I'm paraphrasing here because I don't remember his exact words, in his youth it wasn't what he experienced personally that affected him most deeply about Jim Crow and white supremacy in the South. It's what he heard about secondhand. It made his imagination churn as he would hear stories of white violence. So it had to have left for African Americans a sense that at any moment their life was vulnerable. For white Southerners, it put them in the situation of having to defend these horrible, horrible murders by mobs, and one can only imagine the sort of hypocrisy or the intellectual gymnastics they had to engage in to do that. The consequences, I think, are so deeply rooted in the way in which white and black Southerners have interacted ever since that it's just fundamental to tensions between the two races in the American South and in the United States as a whole.
In the generations to come, people in the North and the South will have very different perceptions about the successes and failures of Reconstruction.
It was a success because the nation did reunite. That is an achievement in itself, despite the difficulties at every single level, great difficulties. It was a failure for African Americans. Freedom was very, very different than they had hoped and anticipated and expected. Freedom for them was living a very poor life, still dependent on the white population. Freedom for them was going to northern states or the West and encountering vicious prejudice, the same kind of prejudice that they lived in the South, knowing that their opportunities were hampered. Suffrage for black men, which they eagerly enjoyed, ended after the Republican Party left the South. So by 1900, it was a rare event for a black man to vote. So Reconstruction has to look like the Civil War in a broader perspective.